2 years had passed since Rain and Blood, and Slayer knew that they weren't going to be able to top that disc. It doesn't matter anymore who released albums, it doesn't matter anymore what the label they were on. They just realized that Rain and Blood was a pinnacle album, a landmark. It was one that has that legendary tag written all over it, and everything from the media to their own fan base really reinforced that fact. So they knew going into South of Heaven that they were going to have to do things a little bit differently. Their response to doing that was one that shocked a lot of individuals and didn't necessarily please all fans, but it's actually caused an album that, here in the future, has become a lot more well respected. South of Heaven is an album that features primarily slowed down tempos, not to mention there's a little less distortion on the guitar, so there's a little bit more cleanliness to the overall production. Gone are the days where every single song seems to have just an absolute chaotic breakneck feel to it. Instead, this is one that feels very much controlled and a little bit more environmentally friendly, so to speak. Slayer didn't go green, probably smoked some green, but in reality, all Slayer really did was take their chaotic sound and give it a little bit more structure. The singing also is a little bit more clean on this album. Think about the transition that James Hetfield went through with Metallica whenever they went from Kill 'Em All to Ride the Lightning and then finally to Master of Puppets. And think about how his singing changed for, say, the Black Album. It's definitely something where there was a big shift and a big mental, real commitment in order to do something like this and ensure that it's going to not try to mirror and copy-paste Rain and Blood to try to make some sort of sequel that would only seem to pale in comparison. So I actually feel that the band went into the studio for South of Heaven with the proper attitude. They recognized whenever they had hit a genius point, whenever they'd hit a level that they probably never imagined that they would hit, but they reached that crescendo and needed to do something a little bit different in order to kind of keep people off balance a little bit, but also to sort of maintain freshness. So I give them a lot of credit for recognition, mainly because if they would have just tried to make Rain and Blood 2, definitely wouldn't have sized up, even though their last 3 albums were definitely ones that almost felt like they were on equal ground in the minds of many fans. I still prefer Show No Mercy. But by any stretch of the imagination, this is certainly not a bad album. I think many people were very harsh on this, considering the cleanliness allowed some of the ideas to be more focused and heard, especially whenever it came to outlets such as the Rolling Stone magazine or anything like that. They just called it satanic drivel, which, if they would have listened to the lyrics a little bit closer, would have realized that that's not all the case. You can easily mishear some lyrics from, say, for example, Silent Scream, and think that it's nothing more than one man's attempt to be as evil as humanly possible. But this is instead a band that was attempting something a little bit different and had this experiment have the fans kind of do a little flip-flop with some of them. And we've seen that in bands ever since then, and we've seen that in the past as well. Many people flip-flopped on a band such as Avenged Sevenfold here recently, and then everything tends to even out. They tend to come back around. This is an album also that's been a grower for many people, and songs such as Mandatory Suicide still remain on the set list. And if you hear other tracks off of this album during a Slayer set, it's one that perpetuates a lot of reaction, and it's usually that of a positive one. It was a grower album for many fans, considering it was very much a shock to their system after growing up with 3 albums that sounded with the way in which it did, with the chaos and the overall atmosphere of destruction. It sounded as though the band went in there, destroyed every part of the studio, and somehow, some way, shat out gold. But instead with this album, it sounded polished. It sounded like someone had worked pretty hard on it, and it had gotten the work over and the comb over, which was what caused and perpetuated the reaction. But the album itself is filled with quality material. This is stuff that if Slayer would have done it within their old tempos and their old frame of mind, no doubt would have still been able to have made an iconic album based around these ideas. They would have sounded a lot more chaotic, a lot more rushed, and would have been absolutely ridiculous to hear. But if you ever want to have some fun, just take one of the songs off this album and, switch the speed up a little bit and see what it sounds like. And you'll know exactly what I mean. It's definitely a bit of a kick in the balls, and it throws you off a little bit. But overall, the flow of this album is very nice. It's one that still still continues the consistency that this band has been able to provide ever since their original debut. It's certainly one that goes about this in a different way. And now think about it this way. Think about the fact that there was a guy that you perhaps partied with whenever you were in school or something like that, and you leave school and you see him a couple of years later, and Instead of him being in a pair of flip-flops, a t-shirt, and a pair of shorts, he's wearing a sweater vest and looks like he is a number cruncher for some big Wall Street company or something like that. It just was a real shock to the system for these folks. But the album overall, very, very solid work. Would probably consider it maybe right on the outside fringe line of my top 5, or maybe in the number 5 slot. It has a lot of redeeming qualities, and the music certainly speaks for itself. But now we have to get into an album that is kind of another Slayer cornerstone. So after having this album come out and having that reaction, a lot of people weren't too sure what was going to happen next. So we need to talk about this album, which is Seasons in the Abyss. You're not going to want to miss it. So stay tuned.